Cinema Film Trace. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production, all the way to release and reception. It is our season 5 finale. We have a special doubleheader, Wes Anderson's The French Dispatch and 2001's The Royal Tenenbaums. Are these technically one of these are my pick? Are they both my picks, Chris? How did we do this time?
I was doing new films this season. You were doing old ones, and you did Tenenbaums, and I originally was planning on doing West Side Story for the new one.
Snooze.
But yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed the film, but I feel like there's just so much more to talk about, especially since I didn't really realize that they had put French Dispatch on premium VOD.
Yeah.
Until you told me. So it just seemed like a no-brainer. And I'm super excited because we're also welcoming onto the cast somebody that I met while doing one of his podcasts. This is Harry from the Trylove podcast. Welcome, Harry.
Hey, thanks, Chris. It's really great to be here, especially for the season finale, and especially to talk about Wes Anderson, because I love him so much. And sometimes I feel like I'm the only one in the world who's crazy about French Dispatch, so I'm really excited to talk about that.
This is going to be a spicy episode. I can feel it already.
Oh, boy. I might have to moderate. Yeah, so before we get into all things Wes, Harry, can you tell us a little bit about Trylove for those listening? We do kind of have listeners both locally here in Minneapolis as well as all over, but I think your cast does a great job at diving into movies, even no matter where you're at. So can you tell people what Trylove is?
Yeah, thanks. It's awesome that you have listeners all over, because we certainly don't, mostly because Trylove is a podcast about movies that me and my friends see at the Trylon Cinema, formerly Micro Cinema, which is an independent movie theater in Minneapolis, Minnesota, very near to all of our apartments. So we started a few years ago, and it's been a lot of fun. But, you know, if you don't go to the Trylon, I mean, they show movies that a lot of people have seen, so you could maybe check that out. But yeah, it's great. You can find it at, I believe it's Trylove Podcast on SoundCloud and Spotify and all that stuff. Yeah. So it's a lot of fun.
Werner Herzog fans, they just went through a selection of films that they did repertory screenings of here in Minneapolis. So any of his filmography you might be interested in diving into. They got some great episodes about that. What's your latest?
Oh, well, we actually just did our awards season, which we do once a year.
Yeah.
So that's the last episode that just came out. A really monumentally terrible place to start if in the off chance that you're interested, because it's like 4 hours long and we just argue with each other a lot, and we find it charming probably, but like if you don't know us, we probably just come off as really pretentious shitty film dudes, which, you know, we are. But before that we did Batman Returns, which was a lot of fun because we had a really good guest on that one. And yeah, and that wasn't at the Trylon or anything. We just wanted to do a Christmas movie, which that technically is. So I like that episode a lot.
Cool. Perfect. Thank you so much, Harry. Let's
thank you.
Dive in to The French Dispatch. This is Wes Anderson's 10th film, correct?
Sure. Yeah.
I think I counted that right.
Yeah.
The auteur has been known for his basically entire run of movies since 1996's Bottle Rocket. I feel like we should probably start with a little personal background.
Yeah, I got to.
I think that I need to kind of take the reins and go first, because my bias is kind of ridiculously apparent right from the get-go, because I, to my knowledge, am the only person that named his own child after a Wes Anderson character.
Oh my God.
So my 9-year-old son's name is Dignan, which is Owen Wilson's character.
Amazing. Wow, what a great choice.
Thank you. So I've been obsessed since I was a teenager, and my yearbook quote for my senior year of high school was a quote from Bottle Rocket, and I've just been a hardcore fan ever since. Though I have to admit, as I said earlier, I might need to moderate, because I have kind of gone lukewarm on him over the years, which feels kind of dirty to say as somebody who named their child after one of his
you're
characters.
Committed at this point. You have to like his movies.
Exactly. But I do have to say I came to French Dispatch, as well as my rewatch of Royal Tenenbaums on its 20th anniversary, with a lot of baggage, not to infer, or should I say, make a reference to the horribly obvious metaphor in 2007's Darjeeling Limited. Do you
Jeez.
do you have? I mean, we've been friends since high school, Dan, but
Yeah.
I feel like you were more like a Rushmore guy, correct?
Yeah, so I came to Wes through Rushmore. I saw the trailer, became obsessed with the trailer. Was able to get it. I think I couldn't see it in the theater because it wasn't playing anywhere in Milwaukee, and then my parents would let me go.
Mhm.
And so I finally got it on video, whenever that would have been, I guess 99. And basically became my favorite film for the next decade, I would say. And so I've probably seen Rushmore 100 times. It was one of those films I'd watch over and over again. Royal Tenenbaums came out after that. Adored that film when it came out. And then, yeah, everybody has I think if you are a true Wes Anderson fan, you kind of have the ups and downs with his films. Didn't love everything he did after that, but I would think Grand Budapest was just a masterpiece as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I've seen everything he's ever done except for Isle of Dogs. And to I love an aspect of every one of his films, but I don't sort of love them overall. But yeah, I mean, I think he's one of, if not the greatest American director working right now. I'm just gonna throw that out there.
Whoa. Okay, Harry, you go.
Wow, I'm in really good company. I'm excited to know that y'all are such big fans. Chris, you didn't say what the bottle rocket quote is in your yearbook. You got to do that.
Oh, okay. It was everybody wants to know what's next. Why can't I just enjoy this moment?
That's great.
Yeah, Owen Wilson says to Anthony, Luke Wilson's character, near the end when they're kind of wrapping things up with James Caan's character, but before they have the wool pulled from behind their eyes.
Right, man. What a heartbreaking movie. What a heartbreaking filmography Wes Anderson has. People don't really talk about how fucking sad all of his movies are.
Gosh.
I love really fucking sad movies. So I actually just saw Bottle Rocket. It was like the last one in my filmography to knock off this year. And we did an episode on it. So I hate to promote
amazing.
again,
I got to go back and listen to that.
It's great. I really, really like that movie. I'm a huge fan of all of Wes Anderson's, and it's a weird thing where like I feel like I've had to be a real defender of Wes Anderson through the years, especially as he's sort of like more of his more idiosyncratic movies like Darjeeling Limited or Grand Budapest Hotel, although that one is really critically beloved. But I think I really agree with Daniel just in the sense that like I feel like as an auteur, however you feel about auteur theory, all of his movies are like really interacting with an idea and a sort of evolving concept of his that feels really literary and feels really complete. And you can tell that he's not just sort of using an aesthetic, he's exploring a theme, that develops over time. And so in a really unique way, I feel that all of his, like each of his new movies can enhance the previous movies. And I've really come to appreciate that, especially as I get older, like I just rewatched Royal Tenenbaums, and coming back to that, I found so much new to enjoy in it, knowing what I know now from French Dispatch and from Grand Budapest Hotel and whatnot. And I feel that way about even the movies of his that I'm not crazy about. Like, for instance, I really don't like Isle of Dogs. Sorry. But I think everybody's got one, right? Like that's kind of an interesting aspect of him as well. But I think I love almost all of his other movies. So yeah, I agree with you. He's a real argument for auteurs, even if you don't necessarily feel great about auteur theory, I think.
Absolutely. I think that while that's a spicy take to have, that he's the best living American filmmaker, I do think there's an argument to be made at the very least, because as we'll get into it, from Royal Tenenbaums all the way to French Dispatch, it's really hard to find anybody else with a through line that with 20 years worth of work, pretty steady work, even when he took many years to create his stop motion pictures. It's still as many people said when Fantastic Mr. Fox came out and when Isle of Dogs came out, it's undeniably still a Wes Anderson movie, even though it's animated. So let's get into this. French Dispatch, what is it? It's kind of hard to nail down. I might go so far as to say that it's his most disparate attempt at a cohesive story. And that's saying a lot for somebody that made Grand Budapest Hotel, which had a sprawling cast, and nearly every picture he's made has some kind of ensemble element to it, if not is just straight an ensemble film. The plot logline is a love letter to journalists set in an outpost of an American newspaper in a fictional 20th century French city that brings to life a collection of stories published in the French Dispatch magazine. Is that really what it's about? Because I just watched this film and it really felt like it wasn't actually about the journalists. Am I wrong in that?
God, that's tough. Because like he went into this movie wanting to make I think a movie about the New Yorker, because he's obsessed with the New Yorker,
right?
Which is, you know, I mean, I kind of grew up hating the New Yorker, and then I went to school and had a class on it and became obsessed with it. So I'm kind of definitely in that boat where it's like, oh yeah, this is like a New Yorker article or issue of the New Yorker essentially as a movie form. I thought the frame would be way more kind of full in this story, and it's really not. Like the concept of making the magazine and stuff like that, it's there, but it's essentially 3 short films kind of stitched together.
Very much an anthology.
Yeah, and that's kind of what he said too. He's basically said, I wanted to make a movie about the New Yorker, I wanted to make a French movie, which and I wanted to make a sort of omnibus, like a portmanteau like type film, and he kind of like smudged them all together, and that's kind of what the French Dispatch is. Which, when I say it out loud, sounds insane. Does this not sound insane? Like It's like sort of like, what's going on here? But it's almost it's something that Wes Anderson can do at this point in his career.
It's so funny how like
go ahead.
It's like he's making movies to spite his detractors, right? Like, even as a Wes Anderson staunch defender, I'm like, the criticism that he is this like cutesy petty bourgeois filmmaker making films about sad rich people. It's like I'm like, Wes, please, like, you have to like prove them wrong, and he just keeps doubling down on it, which you have to kind of respect, I guess. But it's like literally the guy makes a movie shouting out the New Yorker. It's like, could you get more sort of like extreme East Coast bougie than that?
Right. I do think there's something to be said, though, to that really is more apparent in this film than any of his others. The fact that, and I got stuck on this, it took me a while to figure it out while watching the film, is like, why the hell is this dispatch for a magazine in this small Kansas town, right? Like the New Yorker did all these dispatch like feature stories, of course, because it's New York City's beloved institution, right? Like the home of the, upper class elite, but with this, it kind of clicked to me at some point where it's like, okay, number one, this guy literally tried to, like, before the New Yorker's archives were online in 2001, he attempted, like right after Royal Tenenbaums came out and he started making a decent chunk of change for himself and a name for himself, this guy attempted to buy the entire archives of the New Yorker.
Of course he did.
Which is such a dream.
Right. And and it's not only weird because like somebody would, deign to do something like that, but specifically for this kind of guy who, yes, clearly has shown himself to be a New Yorker reader with the Royal Tenenbaums, but rewind 5 years to Bottle Rocket, and this is a guy just like making movies with an 8mm, 16mm camera in his backyard in like outside of Austin, Texas. This isn't a New York City, Paris kind of guy. And so
that's a really good point.
Yeah, that's like so the one of the layers to the New Yorker is that it wasn't made by people from New York, right? Like the New Yorker started as essentially, and that's who Bill Murray's character here is supposed to be, Harold Ross and William Shawn, who took over from him after he died in the 50s. The thing about the New Yorker, and I think when people make fun of it, I always kind of have to laugh at when people get kind of upset about how snobby it is. That's kind of the point, right? It's like essentially people from middle America made that magazine as sort of their idea of what an East Coast intellectual elite would want to read. And so there's this layer of irony to the whole thing that, I don't know, that's part of it in sort of Bill Murray's character. But I think Wes Anderson, to me, is somebody who grew up in Texas, who never wanted to stay in Texas, always felt like an alien. That's the New Yorker is the perfect magazine for him, because it's a magazine created by outsiders trying to create this sort of curated little snow globe world of intellectualism, which doesn't exist outside their magazine.
And I think that what you just mentioned is so insightful, because I think it's a really important thing to remember when it comes to the major theme of alienation sort of across all of Wes Anderson's films, right? Is that just like picture the child Wes Anderson in Texas, and like you do that in all of his characters, from, Steve Zissou to the Royal Tenenbaums to the Moonrise Kingdom kids. They make a lot of sense, right? They're people who don't feel like they belong in the environment that they're a part of, who feel like deeply alienated from it. And you get less of that in French Dispatch, because the POV is so solidly belonging to the journalists. But there's sort of an interesting through line there as well that maybe we can explore a little bit later on. But I really like that point about Wes Anderson in Texas, right? It really makes,
I think that there's something to be said for not only like the outsiderness in general, but also like you mentioned, Dan, that like the New Yorker is these outsiders trying to create this snow globe world, right? Yeah. And this intellectualism is almost like automatically branded with this self-aware artifice that very much is in line with Anderson's entire career.
Absolutely.
Right. Artifice is a fantastic word for it, right? Because like all of his movies are so affected, and like irony has never really been the right word for me with Wes Anderson, because I think there's something much more earnest behind that, and I feel like a lot of people don't get Wes Anderson because they think he's making fun of something, when in reality it's just sort of like all the world's a stage sort of setup, right? Like all of his movies are supposed to look artificial. They're kind of supposed to look like somebody gesturing at what they think something is, right? I think that's even why so many of them are framed the way they are, with like almost every single one of his movies is like a book, or it's a retelling of something else, right?
Yeah. Like a play, Rushmore, right? He's always pointing that he's creating something on screen.
And there's a level of abstraction between reality and you, just like there's a level of abstraction between reality and these characters so often.
And you could even look at that with just the act of journalism in general, especially like feature style journalism. And I think that if you could look at so many examples in the film, but I really felt it as the credits rolled. I really wasn't thinking about the three main stories. I kept coming back to just like the opening local color segment with Owen Wilson, right? Where it's just like, you can imagine, like, he's so well known for world building, but it's such a like, strange, distorted kind of world building, but not one that like makes you feel uneasy, one that makes you feel like invited. And you very much like, that's the point of like creating a snow globe world, right? Is that you want to be there, that you can kind of indulge in that fantasy. And even though, a journalist's job is to take that outside perspective and kind of find a way to map it for your reader, you very much become this kind of like lens, right? Because
absolutely.
And Owen Wilson even like literally says that his character, right, in the film, where he's like, Bill Murray's trying to convince him to like add something, warm and, more popular into his piece about, the scummy aspect of the little village they live in. And he's just like, nope. Even though it's literally there, it's just he gets to choose what he puts in there. Yeah. So does Wes.
And that's a big part of why French Dispatch worked for me so well, I think. I mean, first of all, I think that Wes Anderson's writing has always been one of his great undervalued assets. I think that in a lot of ways, all of his movies have been sort of like consolation prizes for the fact that he didn't get to write for the New Yorker, right? So like it's almost like more obvious than ever at this point, but like the writing in that movie really shines. And for a movie about writing, I think that's so important, right? And especially for a movie like all of his movies that's sort of about transforming something into a story and what that does, right? And like the process of narrativizing events as they happen, and how important the storyteller themselves is within that, and what they bring to it, becomes it that's really central in importance to all of his movies, right? I think all of his movies are sort of about like characters who are alienated from their own sort of legacy or from their own perception of themselves in the worlds, who are trying to sort of preserve that, or even sort of like continue that, or imbue the world with sort of the spirit of what they want it to be.
Yeah.
And I think that making those themes explicit the way that he does in The French Dispatch really works, because it's like it's such a direct continuation for me from Royal Tenenbaums to something like Life Aquatic to Grand Budapest Hotel, right? Which is all about this guy who's trying to hold together the world, right, as it falls apart around him. And I think that that's a really important through line that is as maybe as important, if not more important, than the aesthetic style, which is what everyone talks about when they talk about Wes Anderson, right?
Yeah. Let's talk about these things.
Yeah, of course you want to,
for sure.
Because I think just the piggyback on what you're saying, I think with French Dispatch, for me personally, and we're going to dive right into opinions because I feel like it.
Do it.
I think you're making an argument that is interesting to me, because I felt almost the exact kind of opposite.
Interesting.
Where I felt like the aesthetics here, look, I love the Wes Anderson aesthetic style. I just think it's fun, it's interesting, it's kind of a beautiful trademark that he has on a lot of his shots and coloring. I don't take it too seriously like a lot of people do. Like it is what it is. It's his look. I always find it distracting though when I can't hold on to some sort of emotional narrative that's very clear. Like it's like right out there, right in my face. Like in Royal Tenenbaums, it's just there the entire time.
Sure.
Every scene is just filled with this very clear and confident emotional narrative that story is doing. And when it doesn't work for me, like Steve Zissou, like there was an attempt to make a strong father-son emotional sort of story arc there, but it didn't really work for me. And that's one of the lesser films I think of his work. And I can kind of mirror his ability to make that story clear and concise and make sure it has an emotional hook to it.
That's fascinating.
Versus my enjoyment of it.
Yeah. Well,
right?
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, like the French Dispatch, I couldn't, what you're saying totally makes sense, but I couldn't get my hooks into it.
And that's
I couldn't really figure out what the emotional arc was going on.
Right, and that's a really great criticism of my reading, right? Because Chris, you said early on like that the journalist didn't feel central to the narrative to you, and that hit me sort of weird, because to me they are the narrative very literally, right? In that we are watching these events unfold through them, and to a real extent we don't actually see any of the events occur in this movie. We just read about them in the words of the journalists and through the perspective of the journalist, to the point where like the three aesthetic styles that we explore and the three presentational styles we explore were very clearly sort of frames for that styling by the journalists. But you're still not wrong, right? Like the journalists themselves, they are our POV, but they aren't characters interacting with other characters, which is I think what Daniel's saying, right? Like I think Royal Tenenbaums works so well because the characters are so vivid and distinct and empathetic, right? But here, like we get this, we have a very strange relationship with the main characters because they're kind of not the main characters at all. They're observers, like we're observers, and it can create a sense of disjointedness to the narrative for sure.
Yeah, and I felt this kind of like I have on my notes here Jeffrey Wright highlighted compared to the other two journalists of the three main stories, Tilda Swinton's character and Frances McDormand's character. I feel like of the three, Wright's character is the most fleshed out of the three, but you have definitely, me second guessing my argument because of, what, not just what you were saying, but also what I was saying about like the point of a journalist is to provide that lens. But like very much in Tilda Swinton's story, I'm completely enraptured by Benicio del Toro and Léa Seydoux. And to make Tilda Swinton like one of like the most interesting actors of modern times, a sideline character, just like it like maybe he's doing that on purpose, but it felt wrong to me. But also very impressive that he's able to do that while I'm just completely sucked into the story of the prisoner and the guard.
Right.
Same thing with Frances McDormand's story. Like, to have me focusing more on Timothy Chalamet, who I'm not even like a huge fan of, but like she gets. I don't know. It just felt incongruous to me. But
Sure.
maybe that's part of the point.
Well,
And one of my biggest concerns, I'm curious what you guys think. Not concerns, in curiosities, is that like this also feels like just I thought it immediately as the movie was wrapping up with the obituary. Like, this is something where I'm going to feel more connected to these characters upon rewatch. And Wes Anderson, if nobody else, is a guy that knows how to make movies, destined for rewatches.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you mentioned that. The New Yorker, who is it? Richard Brody, is that his name?
Oh yeah.
He's like, you have to see this movie twice to even understand it.
Mhm.
He might be right. I've seen it once.
yeah,
I
I've
also
seen it
don't
once
think we
as
should be
well.
listening to the New Yorker's opinion of the New Yorker movie.
Right.
I mean, they
Best,
did
best
like a
film of the
whole
year. We
thing
loved
with
it.
They did a whole thing with it. There's like radio
Of course.
interviews. There's
Yeah.
cast reading old New Yorker stories. I kind of love it. It's so slimy. in a way.
It's perfect for the New Yorker, right? It's like you're proving Wes Anderson right.
True.
I really liked what you said. I mean, I don't know. I'm interested now to think through this, right? Because like French Dispatch and Life Aquatic are two of I would put them in the highest pantheon of Wes Anderson's
Wow.
movies.
Interesting.
Maybe it's just like maybe it's a theme thing. Like I think because I agree with Chris's criticisms, and I think that maybe the most damning criticism you can make of French Dispatch is that, in my opinion, maybe arguably the most important story to sort of fleshing out the bones of the theme of the movie, Frances McDormand's, is also far and away the least engaging.
Agreed. Yeah.
And maybe that's because of Timothée Chalamet, or like, but like what Frances McDormand is doing in that story for the themes of the movie, right? About like taking this thing that is actually sort of it's complicated and performative and a little bit silly and pretentious and small, and she's elevating it into something with grace and history, and because those kids are worth it, and because that history is worth it, and what they were fighting for is worth it, even if they didn't really know what they were fighting for, right? And like for her to lionize that narrative because she believes in it, and then for her editor to defend that narrative and believe in it, is like very important to what the movie's doing. But like it's also the least interesting, right? Because like you don't really want to connect with Timothée Chalamet's character because he's played by Timothée Chalamet, and he's pretentious, and he has this annoying relationship with these other characters. And because I think that this is a little bit like, I don't generally agree with the sort of like idea that Wes Anderson is just so interested in his own fancifulness that he loses the plot a little bit, but it's a terribly Wes Anderson move to make a story about a children's revolution in posh France, right? And have it be all about the fashion and all about the sex and the iconography. It's tough. It's a tough thing to defend, even though I think it's very important to what the movie's doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big question I have though with all of this, and hearing about the writers and their interactions with their stories and how they're viewing the world as sort of maybe a throughput here, is definitely something I can think about on a rewatch. But I do wonder if you're sitting down at a script table with him, how many writers are on this? Like 4?
Well, he's the only credited writer, but yes, the story was by not only Wes, but Roman Coppola,
like
common
Hugo,
contributor,
Guinness usually, yeah,
and Jason Schwartzman. Yeah.
So it's sort of like I'm trying to put on my studio production hat right now, and I'm sort of like, well, if we had Hendrix on the show, would Hendrix look at this script and be like, I don't know, like, what is this? Like, what is this all about? I think that the big question I have is, you're going to make a film like this. Is this actually a feature film?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because this is an Indian Paintbrush movie, which is Stephen Rail's company, and he's been with Wes ever since Darjeeling. And you guys mentioned, your low points, and that's my personal low point of Anderson's career. It feels like that was very much a transition from Wes trying to like take input from others to suddenly like he found this guy Rails who's just going to throw money at him no matter what he does. And he's been an automatic green light city since 2007, and I don't
That is
think
a really good point. This is the kind of movie that only Wes Anderson could make. 100%.
Right.
Nobody else would give it the time of day. Absolutely.
Right. To the point where people are like, there was like some memeing going on with like the standing ovation at Cannes with French Dispatch, right? Where it's just like, yeah, I mean, it's to the point where it's, you know, comical almost how just how much free reign this man has had. And obviously there's fanboys like us that are gonna
right. I was gonna say, right,
Yeah.
that's like where my fanboyism shows up, because like,
Right.
especially when you consider like the type of movie he's making and the type of person right, like he's a cis het white dude. He I actually don't know if he's het, sorry, apologies to Wes Anderson if that's not true, but he's like, he is a safer bet than like a lot of other filmmakers would be, right?
Yeah.
And that is kind of frustrating, but like, and so it makes me feel a little bit guilty when I say like, isn't that great though? Isn't it awesome?
I know, right?
He can make whatever the fuck he wants. Like, isn't that exactly what you want him to do? Is to like thumb his nose at the people who are like saying, which is particularly hilarious because I feel exactly the opposite about Quentin Tarantino, right? Who's like maybe the other, and I'm like, oh, fuck off with like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and all those foot shots and everything. It was like, that movie was interminable, and like, but then French Dispatch goes out, and I'm like,
oh, I love Once Upon a Time. I know you guys are crazy.
Yeah, that's fair.
No, I also disliked it. But I think that when it comes down to it, one of my, so that we can kind of find a transition point to talk about Royal Tenenbaums, where maybe we might be in more agreement overall, I have to point out one of the most interesting kind of inverse relationships of critics in response to his films. You have the critics that have kind of stayed with him over the years. This movie, you know, isn't universal acclaim. Solidly in the 70%, like you mentioned earlier, Harry. Like Grand Budapest is seemingly like his high point critically of his career. It's going to be hard to match that, if it even harder to exceed it from this point on. But this is very much in the realm of, you know, the most of his movies. Besides, you know, the earlier ones, Rushmore and Royal Tenenbaums, which also had universal acclaim, right? And the example I'm going to throw out here is one of Dan's favorite critics.
Love this guy. He's the best. He's the best.
Mr. Mick fucking LaSalle of the San Francisco Chronicle, who gave one of the most glowing reviews of Royal Tenenbaums when it came out, but has now come to seemingly loathe what Wes Anderson has done.
Wow, what happened?
You know, it's interesting. We'll start with French Dispatch because that's where he is. The quote I have from him is, "The artistic signature is unmistakable. 30 seconds in, you'd know you were watching a Wes Anderson movie. But Anderson's human connection seems to have short-circuited, so that his irony now bypasses the world and becomes an ironic contemplation of his own work. This is a dead end, and it's just not interesting." Compare that. Hold up.
4 stars.
Yeah, hold up. Compare that with a more measured review. Dana Stevens of Slate, and while Dana hasn't been with Slate forever, you had Dave Remnick of Slate in 2001 disparaging Royal Tenenbaums for a lot of the same kind of criticisms that Mick LaSalle just gave. But Dana now in 2021 says, "The French Dispatch is a movie made with such deliberate, patient skill and such brio that its meandering structure and oddly low emotional temperature come off as intentional choices rather than errors of artistic judgment. Even if it's not my favorite flavor of Wes Anderson licorice, nothing is there by accident." I feel like that's where I'm at.
That's
now,
fair.
I'm wondering, Harry, if you agree with this quote from a very glowing review of Dispatch. It's from Clarice Lawfrey of The Independent. She says, the very best of Anderson's film, Dispatch is both utterly exquisite and deceptively complex. A film that, like the finest of dishes, is even richer in its aftertaste.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't know. I fall in a weird place with it, right? Because I think that it is complex in the sense that there's so much to talk about with it, right? And I feel kind of bad because I sort of like short-circuited our own discussion of the aesthetic, and I think this is like one of his most thoughtfully designed and arranged movies.
Yeah.
There's some shots in it that are just so well organized and like created that it's like nobody else could get something like that, right? And so I love it for that. But I think that it's strange, right? Because like this feels emotionally and emotively very similar to the Grand Budapest Hotel to me, in that there is sort of a third act fall where all of a sudden retroactively the entire movie becomes extraordinarily melancholy and wistful and nostalgic and about things that are gone and will not come again. It's this movie maybe is even like better at sort of prefiguring it than Budapest is, although Budapest is great at it because like it's an obituary from the drop, right? And so like I don't know, I think that like it ends up in a really great place where it's complex in the sense that like there is mournfulness running through the entire movie on top of all of the other things that you explore, and it that mournfulness sort of transforms your understanding of each of these stories when you know that they were made possible by and sort of championed by somebody who is now gone. And that's sort of an incalculable loss to not only journalism and not only sort of like writing, but also like meaning making sort of like writ large, right? It sort of makes this case for journalists as imbuing the world with this sort of like spirit of what could and should be, and that spirit is sort of protected by and nurtured by editors, and when the editor goes away, we are at risk of losing that thing, and isn't losing that thing something that is so frightening and sad to consider, right? So like I think it really is complex in that sense.
I mean, now that you say that, it's something that didn't even cross my mind. Partially because of like the movie's been on the shelf for a while, but one of the things that's refreshing about it is that it feels so disconnected from what's going on in the world today. But you just made a very fair argument, I think, Harry, that you could easily look at that in contrast to the kind of world we're given today, with not only the state of journalism on a very on the nose kind of comment, but also with just like, I mean, human relationships, which is at the end of the day, I think what we all come to Wes Anderson for. And it's just that, the human relationships of how we ingest media and how we look for stories outside of ourselves in environments that are not our homes, is just as valid and just as transformational as those that are interpersonal and familial, like we'll get to at the Royal Tenenbaums.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think I understand that the criticisms about low emotional temperature and stuff, but I feel like maybe that's just the beat of Wes Anderson movies that you have to get into, right? Because like these are deeply alienated, sort of disaffected characters, and that can make relating to them difficult or something. But I don't know. I think it really worked for me this time.
And I think the aspect of, as you mentioned with Grand Budapest Hotel, Gustav's character is trying to like hold, like as you mentioned, the world around him, and that world is the hotel, and that's also like this kind of more disparate, low emotional temperature kind of thing. But I mean, I think the thing that worked for me with that film is that third act fall, and it becomes not just the duties and responsibility of Ray Fiennes' character, but his also kind of interactions and almost like mentorship with Zero, and that becomes such a like integral piece to me that it feels like I get that kind of high emotional temperature that I got from Royal Tenenbaums.
Yeah, well, it's like once he's gone, you understand what he was and what he was doing.
Yeah, and so that's almost like what I mean, not to say like I wish the movie had done this because I hate doing that, but I mean, I loved every scene with Bill Murray, but every one of them felt cut short. And then you're given this obituary at the end, and I'm like, I barely got to know this guy, but I really loved like certain beats in the film, like the editor's funeral and the, conversation, like I mentioned earlier, between him and Owen Wilson at the front of the film. Even like the little details, like Jason Schwartzman's New Yorker-esque doodle of him. feel very warm and very much for the argument that there is this kind of family aspect at the newspaper. I wanted to get more of Elizabeth Moss and Fisher Stevens.
It would have been great. Yeah. It's
Right.
funny, right? Because like I love the movie as it exists, but like hearing you describe that now, like I would have loved a movie about the French Dispatch.
Yeah. So like I almost like there was a part of me, I wrote it in our notes here. I almost, and I hate the runtime discourse that's happening constantly in and out about how long movies should be, but I almost want this to be kind of a bloated, like if he was going to get this insane, like give
Yeah.
me a 3-hour Wes Anderson movie. I will sit down and soak in every minute of it.
I would love a 3-hour Wes Anderson movie.
But I don't think Dan would agree.
I mean, here's the thing. It's like with the French Dispatch, it is absolutely the most elaborate production design and sets that he's ever done. The shots are over the place. He goes black and white. He goes color. He goes animation.
Aspect ratios, once again.
Yeah. And it was funny. There's an amazing interview that Tilda Swinton does of him in Sight and Sound. It's in the October 2021 edition. And he talks about that. He basically says that, doing a film style in this way gave him the freedom to do whatever he wanted. And he said essentially that not having that arc gave him the ability to make what was ever in his head or in his heart in that moment. And that absolutely comes through.
Yeah.
But he admits in the same paragraph in the interview, I don't know if it actually works. He says this. He says this on the release interview. And it's like, that to me is so, I mean, it's why I love him as a director and an artist. Like, he's absolutely fearless. Like, he just does exactly what he wants to do. He has such a strong and passionate vision for cinema. And he kind of, he puts himself out there on the ledge and sometimes he falls over. And in this case, for me, it's sort of, I can't, if I was the Mick LaSalle situation, that's a little bit harsh. Now that actual review that he gave was it was right after the premiere, I think, in the San Francisco area. And it seemed kind of like a rushed review that he had to put out or something.
Sure.
Not a great review from him. Yeah, hot take, exactly. There's no way on a scale of 1 to 5 you could objectively give this lower than a 3. Like, it's not possible.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's such a beautiful film. You could look at it in so many different directions and it works just as a piece of art.
Yeah, I mean, even if there wasn't any dialogue, it's like Wes Anderson is building cinematography that nobody else can touch.
Absolutely.
Like, true.
So, I mean, that's the thing for me. It's never going to reach the heights of, to me personally, of Rushmore or Royal Tenenbaums or Grand Budapest Hotel. But there's something magical here that you can't deny. That if you love film, you're probably going to get something out of this. But I do kind of wonder, viewing it in comparison to Royal Tenenbaums, how you guys see it in relation to that film, which is just as twee as this, but has a central story, a central arc. How do we feel like he navigates between is the criticism here that I'm making accurate or sort of proven that if Wes Anderson dives into himself too much and is almost given too much freedom, it's the old sort of editor versus filmmaker argument.
Ironically,
here.
Right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Or like, when we talked about this on another episode about like a writer versus their editor, and the New Yorker has a huge example of this.
Sure.
With Raymond Carver, we talked about it last episode.
Right.
I do wonder, well, first of all, how do you guys relate this film in terms of your love of it compared to a Royal Tenenbaums?
I think that there's so much to consider. So I'm just going to throw the first thing that came to my mind, which is that while both films have Robert Yeoman behind the lens, the two big differences I feel, and there was an interesting interview with editor Andrew Weisblum who did French Dispatch, where basically, Wes has gotten to this point where he's got everything mapped out. He's got an animatic. He's got the, incredibly detailed storyboards. He even starting with Fantastic Mr. Fox, started doing like voice dubs of the characters to like show the delivery of each line to his actors. So it's almost as if he's diving into himself because he has so much total control. It's that, old, maybe it's a myth. I feel like there might be some truth to it. And I say this still as, someone 20 years older, where like the hunger that this guy probably still had in the throes of making Royal Tenenbaums. Yes, he's off this high of like critical acclaim for Rushmore and finally like getting, Buena Vista to distribute his films. But he still feels like he has something to prove.
That's a really good point.
And he has that kind of more, and the other thing that Weisblum says is that like they kind of just do, whatever they want. It's like on the fly. He's got all these other things mapped out, but when it comes to like sitting down in the editing booth, like they're just trying different things out because they have the time and the money to do that. Whereas, Tenenbaums, different editor. Also, the music is Mark Mothersbaugh from Devo instead of Alexandre Desplat, who's very much more like ornate traditionalist kind of composer. And you have also this very, tight-knit cast that is having to be convinced to be in his movies rather than like lining up around the block to. And that Gene Hackman performance is like iconic partially because it took him so long to sign on to the movie to agree to be in it, because it's not the kind of movie you would ever expect Gene Hackman to be in, especially back in 2001.
Well, it's so funny because it's like you got Gene Hackman and then Royal Tenenbaum is such a weird fit. He's like almost playing against type super deliberately, right? Where it's like Gene Hackman is like this amazing, austere, imposing, like incredible actor. And then you have him like talking like he's in disco or something, right? That's a really good point. I think that I would characterize it similarly. It's hard not to think with the argument you just laid out that French Dispatch is like very much an exaltation of Wes Anderson's established style. He's having fun with it as a master, right? Whereas everything about Royal Tenenbaums seems like it wants to prove itself, right? Like I'm comparing even the first scene where like we get the great narration with Alec Baldwin, and then we're introduced to all of the characters. That's the most French Dispatch part of that movie, right? But it's so different because there it's like you can make a movie like this. Like I can establish characterization and make you care about these people this way. Everything about that definitely feels hungry, exactly like you said, right? Where it's like this is Wes Anderson like proving his thesis, Whereas with French Dispatch, I don't get any sense that he feels he needs to prove himself. It's almost a movie that exalts in the security of being established, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, what's your history with Royal Tenenbaums, Dan? Because I know like you were coming off of like being obsessive over Rushmore.
Yeah.
I loved Rushmore, but I was still like very much obsessive over Bottle Rocket. And it's a very formative time to see a movie. You and I are seniors in high school when this comes out.
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw it 4 times in the theater.
Yeah, me too, man.
I watched it over and over again. And I think on the rewatch I had about a week ago, and I've, I have the Criterion edition of it. I've, watched it over the years. Whenever it's on TV, I just, I sit with it for a bit. I'm just blown away by how well it's held up. There is something in, for all the criticisms of Wes Anderson kind of being precious about his, his style and stuff, that hard work and precision is what makes that film so age so well. It is like every single shot is composed meticulously. And then that's, to sort of think about the production of Royal Tenenbaums, getting Gene Hackman was very tough. It took he wrote the part for him. He took a lot of convincing. Finally, Gene Hackman's agent was basically like, you should do this. That's the only reason he did the film. And on set, it was not easy. Him and Wes got into fights constantly. There's even one famous incident where, Gene Hackman tells off Chaz in the game room closet. Well, that actually happened with him and Wes, where they're basically almost coming to blows because Wes had such a specific, almost, I think in one of the interviews, they called him a kind of a gentle general on set, where his vision was so confident and so decisive that it could really rub some of the actors the wrong way. But yeah, I mean, looking back at it now, that style just it fuses the film with something very special that feels timeless in a way.
Yeah,
it felt like a classic when it came out.
It's such he's got to be on the like far side of the spectrum, right? Like I just saw Licorice Pizza too, and it's like you can tell in that movie they were all having fun and they were all improvising and ad-libbing and sort of just like grooving with it. Imagine trying to ad-lib in a Wes Anderson movie, right? He'd be so mad. I mean, like he's got to be an absolute fascist on the set. And like,
it's funny. Like there's a New Yorker interview with him now, and the editor basically of the interviewer goes, so how are you on set? And he goes, I let the actors do their thing. And then Jeffrey Wright like literally jumps in the interview. And he's like, well, I have a different perspective on that. And then that's where I got the gentle giant or general thing coming from. Like, yeah, he controls his area, like without a doubt. But I mean, I think the results sort of speak for themselves with a movie like Royal Tenenbaums.
I think Royal Tenenbaums might be the example, right? Like you were saying.
Yeah. And it's like, I think, you had definitely ensemble elements in Bottle Rocket and Rushmore, but essentially you have protagonists. And you could definitely argue that Royal is the titular protagonist of the Royal Tenenbaums, but that's where it really like kind of gets into this new territory that felt very exciting, I remember at the time, and still felt exciting rewatching it the other day, where there's this kind of expansiveness to that universe, even if it's just that, Brownstone and Eli's house and a couple other locations, the hotel. Also I definitely felt like some, precursors, foreshadowing to Grand Budapest there too, where you had this kind of element that is still very kind of small because yes, it's just one family, but because of like you mentioned Harry earlier, like Alec Baldwin's narration and like the chapter book style of it,
right?
There's this kind of, I don't know, it felt like very eye-opening at the time, I remember, where it's like, and somebody did a review, I think it was just like a user review that I read somewhere where they said like, I think maybe you put it on here, Dan, in our notes about like watching a Wes Anderson movie is like reading a novel and like picturing it in your head. Yeah. And it's just like, especially as I'm like, thinking more seriously about literature for the first time in my life as a senior in high school and like thinking about what I'm going to do in college, that really resonated. Yeah, it's like, my gosh, like films can be literary, right?
Yeah. Well, and this is it's the most literary movie in the sense that he literally frames it that way, right? Like,
exactly.
The movie opens with you being like Wes Anderson taking you by the hand and saying like, okay, read a book. Like this is you reading a book now. Remember that.
Yeah, totally.
It's funny you picked that line out because that's a YouTube comment.
Yeah,
that's a YouTube comment that I found on
the only helpful YouTube comment that's ever been posted. Maybe.
I mean, you gotta troll through YouTube. There's some good stuff out on there. But to me, that is like one of my favorite things that someone said about Wes Anderson, because that's really what it is about his work.
Absolutely,
it is so clearly a story that is imagined in the richest sense possible. And I don't know what it is about his imagination. It's pure imagination. And I don't know what it is about his ability to do that, but it makes those stories seem to live on forever.
Right. And that's what makes even something like French Dispatch work for me so well, is that the realization of his storybook sensibilities, like in a novel, it creates this sense where the themes and the through lines that he's driving at can permeate the multiple stories, right? And maybe it did it better in Royal Tenenbaums, but Royal Tenenbaums is a novelistic novel or movie, not just in the sense of the framing, but also that there are a million characters in side plots, right? But all of those side plots actually contribute to the primary message really, really well, and they integrate with each other so well. And I think that the only way you do that is by exactly what you described, Daniel, right? Like it has to be like a novel that you're picturing.
Yeah, exactly. Like you kind of have to go there with him. And I think, one of the things about Wes Anderson is there is this instant backlash to him.
Yes.
It's gotten kind of weird because we've grown up with it. Like, you guys remember when Rushmore came out? Bottle Rocket, nobody saw Bottle Rocket, right? Rushmore comes out and you're like, very twee, but wasn't big enough to have backlash, really.
Mhm.
Royal Tenenbaums is where it really started. That sort of instant sort of, this is weird. And you see it. I love reading through like these comments and stuff because you get people that are like, there's an old Rushmore interview with him and Charlie Rose. And like some of the YouTube comments were like, I love his movies, but all his characters are really weird and I don't know why. Right. And I kind of wonder, what do we do with this large group of people that approach his films with that sort of instant distaste to it?
Right. And like, where does that come from? You know, like, is it just bullshit like American cowboy toxic masculinity where like we're so afraid of anything that is sort of like openly twee and not hyper masculine that it feels like we feel like it reflects on us poorly if we like that or something? Because like that, it's so visceral and immediate, like you said, that hatred of Wes Anderson, or like, and to the point where like even his staunchest defenders have to like account for it, right? They have to be like, well, you have to like his style. It's like, fuck off, right? Like I think he makes great movies. Like, I don't know. I agree with that. It's so weird. And I mean, his characters are weird and they live in weird worlds, but like, guess what? So do we. So,
right. Yeah. You know what I find so bizarre about specifically Royal Tenenbaums and like the advent of franchise movies kind of dominating the industry in the early 2000s, and yet still like even in those franchises, like I'm just quickly searching the box office for 2001 and the top two movies are Harry Potter and Shrek. And you know, especially with hindsight, we see that as just kind of like very populist kind of money grabbing, but you might have some nostalgia for it. I personally don't. And yet still like the themes of those films and even some of the aesthetics, especially of the Harry Potter universe, are essentially like outsider and ornate, and you might even say like very like specifically aesthetically rendered, right? Maybe those are two opposite ends because Shrek very much represents kind of like the ugliness of you know, new animation in the new millennium, but you have this really kind of thematic stronghold, which maybe is what, you know, brought Wes over to the world of Disney, like to the point where like I can stream Fantastic Mr. Fox and Isle of Dogs on Disney Plus right next to like the most like awful generic bullcrap like Home Sweet Home Alone. And yet you have this very very much like prevalent kind of weirdness. And the other thing that kind of blows my mind, just as a personal example of this, my mother-in-law, love her to death, but she keeps calling whenever Wes Anderson comes up in conversation, she's like, every movie of his feels like a nightmare that I want to get out of.
Oh, wow.
And yet one of my mother-in-law's favorite films is Napoleon Dynamite.
Interesting.
Which like is very much known for like cribbing so much of like the pastel and kind of aesthetic of Wes Anderson.
I love that distinction. The thing there too is what I find so fascinating, and I had to highlight this in our notes, going through the critical response of Royal Tenenbaums. It's all off the charts. You know, like the critics love it. It's got a great Letterboxd score. It's God tier on Letterboxd, essentially, which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Because that's where Wes Anderson fans go to hang out. But the cinema score was a C-.
Yes.
And that is like a C- cinema score is essentially like an F. Like a major release very rarely goes below a B. And a C- is just a really horrific score. I wonder what it is, you know, because that's the people that showed up opening night, Friday night, to see this. And that was their score for it. They absolutely hated the film. But now it has this really robust sort of stature to it. How do we navigate any of that?
Is Wes Anderson's style of characterization just that inaccessible, I wonder? I mean, I keep going back to that weird characters comment, right?
Yeah.
Because that, I mean, I think that's a really weirdly good point, because all of his characters are deeply alienated people who don't feel like they belong in the world that they inhabit, even though that world created them. And it manifests in such like behaviors that are disaffected and self-destructive and weird, right? Like, I mean, all of the Royal Tenenbaums characters are deeply weird, messed up people, right? That's kind of the point of the movie. And I just wonder if we as sort of, and I don't know, maybe the cinema score is outside of America, but like, especially in America, I wonder if like we have a very limited acceptance of what is allowed to be weird, where like, if you want a character who is weird or who is alienated, it better be with stoicism and rugged individuality, right? And it has to be characters that are like that depart from the world in order to be rugged and manly on their own. And maybe characters whose alienation doesn't manifest that way or people we're not as comfortable with, right? Because like it is more uncomfortable to confront the fact that Richie is in love with Margot than it is to like confront a character who has given up on the world or something, right?
Yeah, I think it's a great point because there's an acceptable weird and unacceptable weird. And an acceptable weird, the one I always go back to is Zach Galifianakis' character in Hangover. Super weird guy, but like it kind of fits into this sort of haha funny, let's laugh with him and Adam at the same time.
Right.
Very popular character, but super, super weird. Wes Anderson characters are like, they're intellectuals. They are alien to their immediate surroundings. He almost goes out of his way to make the characters unlikable to the average American, I would say.
Right.
Like they're just not likable. Like no one in Royal Tenenbaums, like who can identify with any of those people? Like in like Nebraska. No offense, Nebraska.
I mean, we're all,
you know what I mean? Like
cash,
how
right?
how are you going to identify with them? You know, I'm not a playwright. I'm not like a novelist. I'm not like a, you know, it's but therein lies the reason why I love it, because I know that it's a creation, and the average person I don't think gets that. And to me, the distaste is one of, he's essentially a postmodern filmmaker where he shows you the tools of creation, and people cannot stand that because they want to go to a movie and feel like I'm disappearing and this is all real, but I know that it's imaginary. They don't want to know that, hey, this is imaginary. He's telling me it's imaginary, you know?
Man, I'm so glad you said that. I've been trying not to say postmodern like this whole podcast.
Oh no,
I think
we say it at least 10 times a show.
I
think
love
he's pretty late in the game.
He's like maybe the great meta postmodernist of our time in terms of filmmaking, right? He's a person who is using the tools of postmodernism to comment on what postmodernism has wrought on society, right? It has made all of these weird, hyper individual, hyper isolated people who were created by their circumstances in their lives, but who simultaneously feel deeply disaffected by those things, right? Because of culture or society or what have you. And like his style is the perfect mechanism for exploring that because it is similarly alienating, right? It's like you don't understand the world that these people are in, and you don't understand exactly how they came to be the way they are, but you can empathize with them in this refracted sort of like through the looking glass way.
Exactly.
And it works so well for me, especially in something like Royal Tenenbaums, where it's all on the field, right? Like all of these characters are exactly supposed to be like that. You also mentioned like that these are all like rich, unapproachable people. I wonder if there's like a class element to that. I also wonder if there's like I'm not a queer person, so I don't have the right to say this, but I have always wondered if like there's just a lot of like sort of like queer phobia surrounding Wes Anderson's movies.
100%.
Because like all of his characters are queer coded, right? Like every last one of the Tenenbaums is.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say that like it makes, I think his sensibility makes people uncomfortable on some level. It's just not the type of aesthetic, the type of people that they're just used to understanding or empathizing with.
So, but despite that horrific cinema score, I mean, this is kind of like where he bloomed in his career, right?
Yeah.
So, like, how do you square that? And like, even to the point where now, like, French Dispatch had the best COVID era per theater average on its weekend of release, right?
Yeah.
Royal Tenenbaums makes 2.6 times its production budget in worldwide box office receipts. Like, this guy explodes onto the scene. Yeah, it's partially with the help of, Disney and the critical acclaim held over from Rushmore, and maybe partly also, I remember part of the reason Rushmore kind of exploded onto the scene because it was, heralded as the return of Bill Murray, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
good point.
what's going on here? Like, how did this movie get such a bad focus group score and yet still, end up being a reasonable hit that, kicked off this 20-year journey for the auteur Wes Anderson?
Yeah, that's so interesting, because it's also like there's not, and this is me being haughty, and I don't mean I don't think I'm better than anybody, right? But like, is there a little bit of the Coen Brothers effect where like people feel pressured to like Coen Brothers movies because it makes them sound smart? You know what I mean? But like, I don't think anybody feels that way about Wes Anderson movies.
Yeah, I don't know. I would argue that there is definitely within certain groups of people. I remember when Steve Zissou came out, I don't know where I was. I was around some arty people, and there was a sort of pressure, I think, to think that it was really good. And I think, what is it about this sort of polarity, and how did that come to be? I mean, like, I don't know. Let's go ahead and trace the political divergence that is happening now to Royal Tenenbaums. I think that was the moment.
It's George Bush's fault. Is that what we're going?
Yeah. Royal Tenenbaums is going to cause the second civil war in the United States. I'm going to call it right now.
But I mean, there's something.
But there's something to that, though. I am BSing, but like, there's a type of person in this country who sees stuff like this and says, "Oh, that's interesting. That's cool." There's another type that sees it and says, "That's weird and gross. I don't get it. Go away."
Right.
It's two different persontwee types.
Wes Anderson is making movies for the
people who aren't.
The loathsome coastal elites. Well, middle America can't stand his twee fairy-like movies, right?
I mean, it's not that far. I mean,
it's an overgeneralization, but there's a kernel of truth to the point that, I mean, I've been struggling with this ever since, like, I've taught film studies at the high school level, and I'm obsessed with Wes Anderson, and when my kids after a character from one of his movies, and yet, like, I can't find a justifiable place for him on my syllabus, and like, I just don't feel like that's it works as an entry point for a class where I'm trying to like open up the world of cinema, and it makes a lot more sense to do that with Bong Joon-ho or with Ridley Scott or something like that. And I think that there's
fascinating.
That is really fascinating.
There's something where I'm stuck on it because it's, and maybe it, keep it simple, stupid, Occam's razor. It's just the idiosyncrasy is at such an exorbitant level, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And like it
Who's
feels like magic.
Too?
What's that?
Who's the entry point too? Like that's
he's such a destination. Absolutely.
Right. Like there's no who is out there copying Wes Anderson besides Noah Baumbach, who's not as good.
Hey, but also a collaborator of his.
Oh, was he? What was he a collaborator? I forget.
Fantastic Mr. Fox.
Yeah. That's why I don't like that much.
Oh my gosh,
I love Fantastic Mr. Fox.
Yeah,
I saw that 3 times in the theater, and I just couldn't. I almost had this weird sadness to it. Like, why can't I connect?
It totally does. Well, that's why I laughed when Chris, you brought up that it's on Disney Plus, because I love this idea of a bunch of kids being like, "Oh, we're gonna watch this great animated movie about this middle-aged crisis that this guy is going through."
I know my kids love it though. But
I thought it was bizarre when I was like 28 when it came out. I was like,
right,
this is off the wall. But no, I think that's a really who where does he sit? Obviously we all love him. He's going to continue to make films for the next 20 years easily. Where's he going to sit? Like, where does he sit versus the Coen brothers versus, I don't know, who's in the Spielberg,
Tarantino, right?
Yeah, Tarantino. Where does he sit in that sort of on the throne there, if at all?
Yeah. I mean, it feels like he's if if Spielberg is the king and Tarantino's the cranky prince, then Wes is like the court jester that nobody really understands the jokes of.
Yeah, I could see that.
Right.
But he's still a fixture. He's still
He'll always be a fixture.
Yeah,
like there's going to be film students in their 20s in 50 years that are going to be Wes Anderson snobs, right? Like he is always going to have a group of people that will follow him, and maybe in a long time from now, there's going to be people aping his style a lot more. Has anybody really tried to do him now? Like.
And like what's fascinating about that too is that I feel like they don't, because not just because they couldn't do it, but because there's almost like a stigma to the Wes Anderson style where they like don't want to be dismissed as cutesy and twee and minor the way that his movies can be.
Yeah, he's also like very easy to imitate, but almost impossible to really capture.
Yeah.
What makes his movies so interesting and kind of like Chris is saying, magical on a level, because that's the magic of Wes Anderson. It's like you don't know what it is.
2001 was also the year of Amelie, right? And I think we saw a lot of that kind of quirky,
like whimsical,
precious, whimsical style throughout the course of the 2000s. I mean, you can draw a straight line, I think, at the very least, from Wes Anderson to like Diablo Cody and Juno.
Absolutely.
Yeah, true.
Also to a lesser extent, like a lot of those kind of overly whimsical films starring comedians that are dramatic, like Stranger Than Fiction.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying.
Like
Little Miss
those
Sunshine,
elements.
can we count that?
Yeah,
maybe?
Little Miss Sunshine, that's a good one too. But those movies are all like so much louder, right? And also still far less idiosyncratic.
Oh, they're dumb compared to
right.
Yeah, that's also true.
Maybe dumb's not the right, blunted.
Yeah. So I think that like it's just not as, there's still people like being inspired and influenced by him in spades, but it's nobody's got like I thinking about this in comparison to like how much aping of Tarantino there was, right, in the late 90s,
right,
and beyond. And it's just like I don't know. There's the postmodern argument about it too, where it's just like it's recycling of recycling. But with Wes Anderson, what makes him such a great postmodern artist is that you can try to ape him, but you will almost indubitably fail.
Well, and I love the metaphor of recycling, right? Because I think that the difference is when Tarantino recycles something, you can see all of its constituent elements.
Yes,
and when Wes Anderson recycles something, it's unrecognizable, right? Like I think that, and you're gonna have to forgive me. This is me being completely on my problematic bullshit, but like honestly, Wes Anderson reminds me a lot of like David Foster Wallace in some ways, right?
Sure.
Where like I keep thinking about the foreword to Infinite Jest, which again, apologies to everybody listening and just throwing up and throwing things at their headphones, I guess. I don't know. But like there's a foreword where he says that like the thing about David Foster Wallace's novels is that they're like a spaceship that is constructed out of all of these alien materials where you go inside and you have no idea how it works. But if all of those materials were things that were found on Earth, right? That's kind of how I feel about Wes Anderson, right? Where it's like he always alludes to all of these inspirations. And I have no doubt that he is like Abed from Community, right? Where he's like a walking encyclopedia of film. But I don't see them in his movies to the extent that I do in like a Tarantino, because all of it is so refracted and so like reprocessed and re-understood for the purposes of what Wes Anderson is applying them toward, that it doesn't feel like he's a filmmaker who is like you said, Chris, like in conversation with anybody, because the conversations he's having are so weird, right?
right.
Yeah.
He's doing a movie that's half New Yorker, half like weird French like 70s films. Like it's so obscure that you can't like find an easy through line. With Tarantino, it's like you just go straight to the exploitation films.
Well, but I mean, the Tarantino sort of foil is awesome because both postmodern filmmakers,
right?
But like Tarantino, it seems like you say recycled, he does like a collage, or pastiche is the term they usually use. Like it feels like he's cutting pieces out of other art forms, and especially film and TV, and putting them together in his own way and stitching them together. I feel like with Wes Anderson, he's taking music, film, all these different things, and kind of like almost like covering them and then stitching it together. There's a, like you said, there's a processing that Anderson is doing that Tarantino kind of isn't. I don't mean that to disparage him. I love Tarantino.
No, yeah, Tarantino fucking rules. Like,
yeah. But there's just there's an element of like it's that imagination, magical dust that Anderson puts on all this stuff.
Visualizing two kindergartners at a table, and Tarantino is the kid that's like violently cutting things out of magazines and pasting them haphazardly, whereas like Wes Anderson has somehow already at the age of 5 learned how to crochet and cross stitch, and he's creating these like beautiful little ornate masterpieces.
Or just like you go to like a modernist museum and you look at a sculpture, and then the artist is like, I made this all out of doorknobs or something. You're like, what's the fuck are you talking about? Like, that's not true. That can't be true.
Not a thing.
Whereas like when Tarantino, like you see every single individual, it's a pastiche, right? Or like a collage, like you said. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's I don't know. There's something wonderful about Wes Anderson, and as much as I sort of didn't love The French Dispatch, there is all of his sort of magical dust all over it. And you can dive into this movie and feel like you're at home with him, just like in his mind, in his imagination, really. And it's a fun place to play around in. I don't know. I mean, that's like the draw to his films. I would like it if there's some sort of emotional story going on that I connect with, but you can't ask for everything, right? How would you guys, in terms of French Dispatch, how do you guys want to close this out? Like, what are some closing thoughts about Wes, Royal, French Dispatch? How do you want to cap this off?
I'll go first so you can have the last word, Harry, as our guest. I think that the biggest thing I'm saying, and we knew this was going to be a supersized episode, but we're already past it. I'm going to keep it simple because there's this thought that keeps popping up in my head as we have these conversations. And I think it's true not only for Wes Anderson, actually, but and maybe it's part of the reason that Wes Anderson is so unmatched, but also such a integral part of the fabric of cinema over the past 20 years, as we've been looking at on this season of Film Trace, of trying to understand like these kind of pinpoints. There's 2 other 2001 films that we looked at this year. Memento and Donnie Darko. Yeah. And I have to say, even though I still love Donnie Darko and still have, some understanding of why people enjoy Christopher Nolan, there's such a like grand maturity to Royal Tenenbaums that I rewatch it and really felt like that moment. Like I can pinpoint the moment when I watched Memento and I was just like, whoa, that was cool. I can pinpoint the moment where I watched Donnie Darko and I was like, whoa, that was weird. Yeah. But to be able to do the cool, the weird, and like the thoughtful, emotional, intellectual, like that is just part and parcel of why Anderson can still make a movie, and I will do whatever I can to see it, even in a pandemic, and pay $20 on premium VOD, because there's something uncanny about what he does, and yet something still like vital and essential. Because to use one more example that I want to pin in here before we close out is like I really saw myself in pieces of Chaz and Eli and Richie when watching Royal Tenenbaums both as a senior in high school and then rewatching it over and over again through my 20s. And now 20 years later, like it really finally hit me for the first time how touching the romance is between Etheline and Henry.
Oh man, that the one scene where he interrupts her at work, quote unquote, and she says it's. I mean, first of all, it's just Angelica Houston and Danny Glover are like absolute titans. Yeah, it's unbelievable. But Man, oh God, I was weeping.
And so I feel like there's this kind of really encapsulating, just like solidness to revisiting this film that I really don't think I felt with any other movie that we reviewed this season. And it comes back to like, I'm glad I looked back at it, because there was a part of me that, wondering like, I mean, Gene Hackman's kind of neuroses, and the attempted suicide with Elliott Smith playing in the
Yeah.
background, after Elliott Smith did commit suicide
Yeah.
uh, a few years afterwards. And it's just like there's so much to it that's layered and that feels like uncomfortable when you think about it, but when you're there in the moment with the screen playing it back, it just feels so perfect. And I once again improving my fanboyism, but I can't I can't imagine that necessarily happening with French Dispatch, but I can definitely imagine it with me going to see whatever Wes Anderson's doing in 2041 with my son, whose name is from his first film.
Wow. Yeah. How about that these days Nico needle drop? That's maybe
Oh
my
my
favorite
gosh.
needle drop in a movie. I think about it maybe every day with Gwyneth Paltrow like walking in slow motion out of the bus. Oh my God.
Her
Yeah.
best role, probably.
Maybe.
Oh yeah, almost certainly, right? Like I don't
Yeah.
know. She's not like I don't think she's a great actress, but this is the best argument for her as a great actress.
Yeah,
Totally.
no, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's weird, right? Like this is very galaxy brain of me, I suppose, but I've always really appreciated Wes Anderson, not just because of like his style and his approach and everything, but also because like in a really unique way, I feel like he is utilizing his art to communicate and help teach things that are important and have been moving to me. And that's particularly where the sort of postmodernism comes in, right? Like I think he's making movies in a scary time that are about a scary time in a lot of ways, and it's a scary interior time or a scary psychological time, right? Like I think he's making movies about characters who are like fundamentally isolated and who are fundamentally sort of like looking back at a world that isn't made for them at the end of that world. You know what I mean? And especially I hate to make everything about climate change, but like especially movies that are sort of like genuinely urgent. I think weirdly almost all of his movies feel that way to me, right? Because they feel like they're preparing me to sort of understand my own alienation and isolation and cope with it or deal with it in some way. And the utility that storytelling or self-determination or identity building has in doing that, right? And the role that we have to play in telling our own stories and sort of like self-creating and recreating ourselves, and why that's difficult and why we're all neuroatypical now. There's just something, every time I see a Wes Anderson movie, I feel like I've come away with something that is really going to teach me something about how I should be thinking about now, and how I should be thinking about myself right now. And so it's always struck me as weird when people say that like his movies are sort of like disaffected or they're not really timely, because they've always felt that way to me. They've always felt like a um like a media saturated kid who is trying to figure things out with the tools that he has to do it, and as a person who is media obsessed and who has always struggled with those same ideas, that's very appealing to me. But I can recognize that maybe not everybody grew up with quite as much fucking old movies and anime and video games and whatnot as I did, So maybe that's part of it. But for me, it's always been he hits me really hard every time.
Oh yeah, every film, even if I don't love it, it hits me something hits me in the right spot every single time. Harry, thanks for being on. We really appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank
Fantastic
you. That was
guest.
so much fun. It was so
Yeah.
great to talk about Wes Anderson with you guys, especially since you're such big fans.
Yeah, well, and we will
Yes.
definitely have you back on here as we get into season. I guess, are we doing seasons, Chris? Maybe we should talk about that real quick. The reboot.
Yeah, we're rebooting this podcast, everybody.
Oh, wow.
We have kind of grown away from this kind of back and forth we've done between new movies and old movies. We're not kind of what's the word? We haven't quenched our thirst for tracing film history.
Yeah, we're not going deep enough. We want to go deeper.
Yeah,
Like
so
Inception.
the basic gist of upcoming batches or cycles or seasons of film trace is that we're going to try to focus not only on a film per episode, but also look at a particular subgenre or keyword of film over the course of 5 or 6 episodes, and look not only at a new film, which we will begin every cycle with, and then go 10 years into film history, staying within that subgenre or keyword. We're going to start it off. It's pretty good segue since we just talked about postmodernism, the idea of postmodern horror movies, or
Ooh.
self-aware horror movies, if you will, with the impending release of, Dan, take it away.
Scream coming out on January 19th. We'll start with that and then do some older films to kind of follow that theme, and then kind of do like a grand finale to that batch of films, and then kind of move on to the next theme that we have. But yeah, we're really excited about it. We're going to get a website up, kind of do some releases with each episode. So we'll obviously share that on social and all that.
Yes.
But yeah, it's an exciting new year for us in 2022 with Film Trace. Harry, where can people find you?
Hey, thanks. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Shiitake Harry, and you can find Trylove Podcast at Trylove Pod, I believe.
Awesome. We will gladly have you back on the season.
Please, I would love to.
2022. You just got to find a theme that you love. We'll have you back on for that. Anyway, thank you for listening, everybody. This has been season 5 of Film Trace.